Desde o seu povoamento pelos portugueses no século XV, a Madeira atraiu vários povos vindos de toda a Europa, trazendo, com os seus interesses económicos, desenvolvimento para a ilha. Os ingleses foram desses povos e a sua presença e influência vê-se crescer com o decorrer dos séculos, estabelecendo relações comerciais de cana-de-açúcar e vinho, posteriormente fortalecidas com o Tratado de Methuen em 1703. A sua presença foi também religiosa, com a construção de várias igrejas protestantes na ilha. Hoje, a igreja anglicana, ou Holy Trinity Church, encontra-se no Funchal, onde foi originalmente mandada construir em 1822 por Henry Veitch. Com as suas colunas, fachadas e planta quadrada, conta mitos e histórias de tensão, onde foram construídos os alicerces que mantêm de pé este edifício de magnífica arquitetura neoclassicista. Cefyn Evans-Emblings, membro da comunidade e igreja anglicana, é quem nos conta a complexa história da presença inglesa na região.
Anyway, to cut a long story short, I came here in 2009 with a project in Encomiada. I sold up everything. I arrived here in my car on the ferry to find out within a week that the project was a way of stealing money from me. It turned out to just literally be a 200-year-old stone cottage in the forest with no road, no connections, and all the land behind that I was supposed to be buying to create the project turned out to be sold by somebody that couldn't prove he owned it. Anyway, I got on really well with the chaplain. I mean, he wasn't your average vicar. Neil, he was the only one in all this history, 200 years, to have studied and learned to speak Portuguese. And he persuaded me that there might be some sort of role for me in the church. I did explain I'm not a practicing Christian and I have a very pagan outlook. And he said, well, never mind, we just need the skill. So I set up the very first church administration role here. So I was the church administrator here for quite a few years, before then giving it up and becoming an archivist, because we discovered that there was a sort of archive here hidden in old boxes and crates, and we assembled it together and created a public accessible church archive. Now you'd think, why would a church archive be important? Well, for two big reasons, is that it was almost exclusively primary source. We still have all the receipts for every salary check that's been paid since 1822. I mean the detail, all the financial records, or all the meetings records, and also all the records of burials, marriages, everything else was here assembled. And then, of course, through reading them, I realised that there were several moments when the church building itself had a huge relevance, not only to Madeira, but British Madeira, but also to the British Empire. So I'm thinking, this needs to be saved, something has to be done about it. And the only way to do it was for me then to take it over. And that's what I've been doing since 2017. So we agreed with Dr. Motta that we would move the entire archive into ABM itself. And that was done. We take up quite a bit of space there. So, if you want a quick history of it all, we were here. Some Brits were here. English were here from the very beginning, so 15th century, but not in vast numbers. They started gaining in power and influence from about the middle of the 17th century, 1650s onwards. They appoint the very first English consul at that period of time, about 1660s. Now that is an interesting indication of how they felt at the time, that Madeira was becoming more and more important to them. And also it's interesting because there was an extra treaty signed between England and Portugal then, which was to do with freedom of religious worship. And you'll find that it was signed not by a monarch, in Britain, because England anyway. England at that time was the only time in its history it didn't have a monarch. Charles had been executed, and it was the time of the English Civil War, and so it was Oliver Cromwell who signed the treaty. For some reason, Cromwell was insistent about the right of English people to practice their religion outside of England. This was a treaty that your King of Portugal signed to say that English people on Portuguese soil would be allowed to practice their religion, their Protestant religion, in private. And as the 17th century progresses, you get that the English merchants mostly on this island started to become more and more important. It's not until the 18th century where they really established themselves. By 1807, 1808, the British were so much in control here that they decided that they were going to build their own church. Okay? Again, they wanted permission, so they wrote to the King of Portugal to ask permission if they could buy some land and build a religious building. He was at that stage in Brazil. So they wrote from here to Brazil. It was in April of that year. And the answer came back within 3 months, which I thought was extraordinary for that time. Yeah, and here, obviously there was an agreement. Yes, you could. And this is where one of the first myths starts, really, that is now being, repeated for generations, especially by the tourist board, is that when the British were given permission, they couldn't build a church that looked like a church. It's complete rubbish. The only clause in this agreement was they couldn't build a bell tower. Instead, of course, much later, we had our own organ, which sort of has the same effect. There's lots of stories about the church building. I mean, by the 1850s, we found out in the notes that the north wall had a problem. The north wall, we thought, was the garden wall that holds back the next properties, and that indeed in the 1990s, was it, collapsed. However, again, researching the primary sources, I finally find documents that go back to the architect engineer who came out from England to survey the building. And it was actually the north wall of the church, George. It was the north wall of the church itself that had started to lean out. And there was a gap at the top where the rain was coming in. And so they found out that there was no foundations. So the rest of the building's got foundations, but not actually the north wall. And that brings me to the next myth, the myth of the Napoleonic gold coins. And this is still touted in tourists. I've had the tourist board send their guides here and I've given them a lecture, but it's still being touted because it's a magic story. Napoleon was brought to Madeira on his way to St. Helena for his final exile, 1815. It was on a British ship. The British wouldn't allow him to get off the boat. So he didn't actually set foot in Madeira, but he was anchored off the bay here. And so Veitch was the only person allowed, he was the British consul, was the only person allowed to go and meet Napoleon. So he goes out onto the boat and he has dinner and the evening spent with Napoleon. And it is true that there was an exchange in that he produced books, wine and food and sold them to Napoleon. Then the story is that Napoleon paid him in gold coins. Veitch was given the gold coins, but in 1817 he is supposedly to be seen to drop the gold coins under the foundation stone of the church. And the gold coins should be still there. So that's the exciting myth. It took us about 6 or 8 weeks with our hands on our knees digging, and we lifted it. There was absolutely nothing there. Nothing at all. Nothing whatsoever. There was a fragment of an old piece of fabric, which could be nothing or something. So we've never discovered any gold coins of any description. But through that process of wanting to investigate that myth, we discovered and were forced to look at huge parts of the archive we hadn't been looked at ever, and discover the whole history of the building. So we brought in a Portuguese Madeiran well-known figure here as an architect, and we commissioned him to carry out a full professional survey of the building. And we used some of his plans in the exhibition at ABM, and it's through him and his exact measurements that we now know that the building here has been built using sacred geometry. So it's exactly the exact measurements of the building. It's a full square. It's exactly 69 feet each wall. Okay, and the word 3 keeps reappearing throughout the building. 33 inches across the doors, 3 feet circumferences to the columns, 36 feet diameter of the circle inside, 3, 3, 3, 3. And it's, of course, it's a magic number. If you draw an invisible line from each of the corners of the building to the center of the dome, it forms a perfect pyramid. They went to great lengths to produce a sacred geometry. It doesn't exist in any of the other Veitch buildings. So I think the fundamental differences between this church and other churches in the Church of England is this church is not so much the property of, but certainly belongs to the British residents. It was given to the British residents of Madeira in 1870 when they created a trust fund. Okay, so it doesn't get any income from England, it doesn't get any income from the Church of England. It has to fundamentally support itself financially, and it also has to finance and run the British cemeteries here. Okay, it's the congregation is important. Now in 2008, before my time here, the church officials here decided to make it even more a part of Portugal. So they created applications, and it's now an associação. So it's an association for religious purposes registered in Portugal. And therefore, in 2017, we made the announcement that we feel that this is a Church of England church with services in English of Madeira. Not separate from, even though the walled gardens might make you feel as if it's separate from, we feel it belongs to Madeira.
A mistura intercultural que hoje se revela na Madeira foi e continua a ser um processo que começou nas primeiras instâncias da sua povoação. A comunidade inglesa, que veio a crescer e a se integrar com os madeirenses, é apenas uma das várias comunidades que participaram na construção dos costumes e tradições da região. Esta difusão faz hoje a uma velocidade exponencial, o que torna difícil apreciar a importância e impacto não só dos povos na Madeira, mas também da Madeira nos vários países que ajudaram a formar esta rede com o Centro Atlântico.